Hello, welcome to this video. This video is going to be about micro-teach, specifically aimed at Level 3 award in adult education and training, although those people studying the Level 4 award or even working at Level 5 or Level 6 may still find some use in it, although I would suggest that if you are studying at a higher level, you just check what your tutor and what your course is actually asking for in your micro-teach, because you may well need more. Okay, so I've got a very basic rationale here which I've adapted, and the rationale is the reason for your teaching, and the best way to do a rationale is before you do your lesson plan, as there is the thinking that goes behind it will make the lesson planning so much easier. And it's the most important thing, really. So we're going to look at some key areas now. Different organisations may have different elements that they want in your rationale, but these are, in my opinion, the most important things to consider. So you have to think about the context of your session. So this is thinking about the setting, the room, the space and facilities, group size, support needs, group dynamics, etc. Once you get an idea of those, it will make choosing what you're going to use in your delivery, or how you're going to deliver, a lot easier. How you would deliver to 4 people is probably quite different to how you deliver to 200 people. If you're delivering in a classroom with lots of equipment, well, that's a little bit different to delivering in a village hall with no electricity. So it does make a difference. Okay, then the aims and objectives, and this is what you hope the students will achieve, and how does this these relate to any module or qualification or aim, and also include your learning outcomes. Now, I've left that in there as the full amount, because if you're doing aims and objectives in a normal rationale, then you will be linking or constructively aligning to the qualifications such as GCSE or an A-level or a Level 3 or a Level 2 award. In a micro-teach, it's a little bit different, and I'll explain that when we get in. Okay, so teaching and learning approaches. So what will you and the learners do? Note the strategies, include notes on how or if you will support literacy, numeracy, ICT or ESDGC, environmental sustainable developmental global citizenship. And because I'm in Wales, we also have Welsh language and Welsh culture to consider. Okay, resources. What resources will be used? The important thing to note is that the resources are there to support and enhance the learning. Resources that aren't doing those are not aligning to anything, and therefore should probably not be used. Okay, assessment, the bridge between learning and understanding. How will you assess learning? Look at the formative, summative and possibly initial stroke prior learning assessments that you will do in your session. Okay, so I'm going to use just before I do that, so here's an example of a lesson plan, and this one you have title, then you have tutor name, particular things to pay attention to, which is why we look at the support needs in our rationale, and then aims, outcomes, teacher activity, learner activity, etc. So if you get your rationale right, the lesson plan becomes ridiculously easy, and I've done that in another video. Okay, so let's now take our rationale away. Okay, now I'm just going to use a Stormboard, which is a nice little app, by the way, to just basically go through my thinking process. I like using things like this. It's how I tend to plan, so I can just move things around and then go, oh, this links to that, links to that. So here we go, context of the session. So I've got a 30-minute micro-teach. Sometimes you might have more, you might have less. But obviously the time will limit what you can or cannot do. It's a limiting factor. So if you've got a topic that's too big, you might just have to do a part of it. I'd suggest, in doubt, talk to your tutor before you deliver. Right, so Size of the group, well, I'm expecting a group of 6 for this. What I've done is I've sort of revisited or tried to remember the micro teach that I did, but seeing as that was a long time ago, I think the world might still have been in black and white. So I'm just trying to remember it, but it will just help, I think. So, group dynamic. So, how are the group performing? Is it a brand new group? Do the group know each other? If your group don't know each other, then you've got to think about things like icebreakers. So, in this case, the group dynamic is performing. They've been together for 3 months. They're actually fellow students who are going to be acting as learners. So it's slightly different to real learners. But that means that because they all know each other, I don't need to include an icebreaker or a getting to know my learners because I already know them. Right, support needs. Well, there are none noted, although it's possible or suspected undiagnosed or undisclosed dyslexia or Verlin's. Useful to plan for things like this, just to show that you're aware of these elements that you've been taught. Obviously, if you know that there are no issues, then you don't have to put them in for that group, but you do have to explain that you know that. Okay, the setting, well, it's a room, it's a formal classroom. Sorry, I've got my abbreviations. With table, chairs, computer projector, they all work, which is quite nice. It makes a pleasant change. 6, the room size is adequate. Obviously, if you're going to present a lecture to 120 people and the class only sits 20, well, then you have a problem, and that's where your Maslow and thinking like that come in. It's not as suitable. So the room size is adequate. Tables and chairs are linear, laid to a linear in lines, which is something that I personally hate. So I'm going to note that I'm going to change it to a group or table, because remember, I've only got 6 for this particular session. So those are the 6 elements. Now then, a couple of other things that you might want to think about. So health and safety. So there's no formal risk assessment, as that is already in place by the hosting organisation. If not, then I would have to prove that or demonstrate that somehow. If you are going to take your micro-teach outside, then you might have to start putting in a basic risk assessment. Double check with the tutor. Okay, but I'm going to do a visual inspection by the tutor prior to the session. A special note to myself because I'm forgetful. Checking chairs, tables, cables and obstructions. Okay, now this is a different room to normal, so therefore I'm just going to make sure that I'm aware of the welfare and emergency procedures, and I will need to just introduce those in the introduction to the session when I do them, because it will be the same case for the group. Now then, there's an exceptional thing in this particular case which you'll note later on. So as I went through everything else, one of my resources is going to be a cake, and that includes a sharp knife. So I've come back to the context because now I've got an exceptional situation. This is a sharp knife. So remember first aid and first aiders. Make sure I know those and can access them. The procedure will be the tutor only to use the knife to be sheathed when not in use. Because I'm also going to have cake, I've also got a food allergy thing, so I need to check food allergies. Ideally, I'm going to try to do that prior to the session. So, and I've just made a little note. Welfare, male and female toilets are next door to the classroom. Emergency procedures, including location of first aid kits and first aiders. That will be introduced in the session because obviously it's a different location to where people have worked on before. Now, all of that, I could, to a certain extent, basically just cut and paste. I'm just going to do this. I mean, obviously, I would do this a little bit more professionally. But, for example, so once I've done it in this think tank, I've basically got it going. I can just cut and paste it into my rationale. Now, personally, I like, and I'm quite happy with bullet pointed rationales. Do check with your tutors whether or not they like that or not. Sometimes in institutions you might have to write it out into paragraphs, etc. And then I would copy the next 3 bits of content over. Time to put that on my other screen. So, now then, aims and objectives. So this is where we're looking at what we hope to do and how the learners are going to achieve this. So this one is a micro teach, so it is a standalone session and therefore does not align to a qualification. So in terms of constructive alignment, there is nothing sitting before it. Obviously there's going to be stuff sitting after it, because in a minute now we're going to come up with a name. If okay, so then I've let's edit that. So what I've said is this is a taster session and could form part of an introduction to understanding archaeology. This could be part of a series on Intro to Archaeology. Stratigraphy is a key concept or threshold concept in archaeology. Okay. Doesn't really matter where your punctuation when you're doing your own notes, but it does matter later on. So now then, rationales. This is for a micro teach, but if you were doing this for a proper course, as a proper lesson in your workplace, then this could change. So this is what it might look like. So an introduction to archaeology, this is an unaccredited course, not the arms. The aims of the course are to introduce key concepts of archaeology to enable visitors to understand the basics of archaeological excavation. So anything that I now do in this would therefore have to align into that. So that would be step one of the constructive alignment, where your bigs come in. So then I would say that this sits within that, whatever. Okay, right. So my aim is an introduction to archaeology. Is too much for 30 minutes. So therefore I'm going to introduce the importance of stratigraphy in archaeological dating. So that is the aim. Understand. I don't like understand. I would like to have something like explain or outline. But that's up to you. What really matters with your learning your aim is the whole thing. The learning outcomes, objectives are how you're going to achieve that. So that aim, as I've said before, because it's a standalone session, that doesn't align to anything in front of it. It becomes the start point. But if it was a course, then that would have to constructively align. That would constructively align to the particular course qualification requirements. Now then I've made a little bit of a note here that now I've thought about the aim. There are some key threshold concepts to consider, which are stratigraphy and key concepts of stratigraphy, which is quite tricky, and archaeological dating, which at this kind of level is actually quite basic, so that's a lot easier. But those I need to pay attention to, because those are the key concepts that need to come out. So here we go. So therefore, to hit those concepts and the aim, I've learning objectives, objects, outcomes. I like objects. You might see them as learning criteria sometimes in a book. So I'm thinking about this. So how about learners recognise and set out the main characteristics? So they could outline the 3 basic laws of stratigraphy, and then we could relate or sequence the link between dating and archaeological stratigraphy. Well, that'll do stratigraphy when the dating comes in there. So those 2 learning outcomes, I feel confident, will actually hit that aim and also satisfy these key concepts. Right. So now, I'm sorry, I've got a cough. So now, I've got my aims and I've got my objectives. So now everything will start falling into place, because actually the context, the aims and the objectives is the hard part. Once you've done that, everything else is going to become a little bit easier, because now you know the context, your support needs, and you also know your levels of the learners, which I didn't note in my context, my session, which I probably should do. And you also know what the aims and outcomes are going to be, the objects that you're going to deal with. Okay, now, the teaching and learning approaches and the resources section, a couple of things you need to do is you have to remember to justify your approaches and the selection of resources. This justification becomes much more important once you move to levels 4, 5 and 6, where you get to the realms of theory. I'll try to note some of those as I go. So, my pre-session, so what I've done is, I've thought about this and I think, well, I'm going to need a pre-session introduction. These micro-teachers are being recorded, so I'm just going to let people know, and they've already given permission to be recorded, otherwise they wouldn't be doing the micro-teachers. But it's always a good idea, whenever you're recording, let people know that they're being recorded so they have the option to leave or not be in there if they don't want to. So I'm also going to, if you remember, I need to pay attention to the welfare emergency procedures, because this is a room we haven't used before, and I've learnt that from my context. I also need to, at this point, introduce my aim and learning outcomes. As William says, how can you expect people to know where they're going if they don't know what the learning intention is? There are methods of doing it without formally introducing your learning outcomes, but if in doubt, introduce your learning outcomes until you're more confident, because what's more important is the learners know where they're going. It doesn't have to be formally stated all the time. But I think unless you're really confident, then introduce your learning outcomes at this point. And remember to make sure your learning outcomes are understood, which is that assessment. We'll come to that in a minute. So then I'm going to do, right, okay, well I got this key concept of the 3 key areas of stratigraphy concepts. So I'm going to do an introductory brief lecture, tutor-led lecture, of stratigraphy and dating, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation to do this, which I can use, remember, because I know that there is a projection computer in this room. If they didn't, then I would have to be thinking about having extra resources of taking a computer and a projector and a screen, which is not always the easiest of things to do. And if there's no electricity, well, you can't do it. Well, actually you can, but you then have to come up with a way of doing it without electricity. Okay, now my activity, I'm going to model, which means I'm going to show, demonstrate, and then learners can do it, is to excavate, eat, and arrange the dating material. Inside the cake are going to be inclusions, chocolate, bits of chocolate, bits of biscuit, and these are going to be the finds that we're going to date as we come across them. It's going to require a handout, but you'll see that in a minute. And there's going to be some self-assessment in the dating, question and answers. What I've forgotten to put there is that then after the activity, we're then going to do a plenary. So I've expanded those out. So activity 1, tutor use. So in the activity, when they're doing the cake, tutors using observations and add content as required, creates a dating record and contextualize approach. So it mimics a simple site. It is thinking to learning outcome 1 and 2. This should have been first, but I've done it in the wrong way around because of my numbering system, so I'll just switch them around. The actual first part of the session, so I should change that to a 1, not 2. After the introduction is a tutor-led lecture on the concepts of stratigraphy and the importance of those to dating. It's going to be supported by a handout, but you'll see that in a minute. I'll just renumber these in case I ever use this board again. Right, so, and I've only got half an hour, remember, and this is probably going to take at least 15 minutes. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go and eat some cake. Oh, it's a terrible job, mine. Just to check the timings of that. Okay, then we're going to have a plenary sort of session close, and this is going to be a tutor facilitated discussion, and I'm just making a note of what I am expecting to come out of this discussion. So I'm expecting all of my learners to demonstrate knowledge of stratigraphy, order of deposition, linked to date, some to get a more grip of the strategic matrix, and a few about the importance of secure context and context in archaeology. So I've differentiated a little bit of allowing for like more able or more talented, but the basics will still meet all of the intended aim and outcomes for this particular session. Right. Now, what resources am I going to use to help doing that? So on here, I've noted that there's a cake, so I haven't put in, so I better put in. Right, okay, because I've now added a PowerPoint. So I've got a PowerPoint with images, tutor zone, therefore no copyright issues. Okay, superb. I'm not going to list the very basic ones that I would take with me, but you could, if you wanted to, if you're really forgetful, I'd put them on my lesson plans. Pens, paper, those kind of things. So I'm not going to list, I'm going to put that on a USB, and I'm also not going to link that I'm going to use my clicker, which is a really good tool. It means you don't have to keep pressing the button on the computer. Right. Now then, important note, especially in micro teachers, everyone's going to tell you that yeah, the tech's going to be fine, the tech's going to work. Contingency planning is what will you do if the tech does not work. So it's worth noting, and tech failures are very common in education. You talk to a teacher and they'll bore you with their first experience of it all going horribly wrong. It's only a group of 6, so it's not too bad. Print out PDFs of PPT case tech failure. So that's what we would call contingency planning. Okay, now then, so that I can go and draw over to there. So nobody lets me do that. There we go. So that's the resource that I'm going to use for this. Okay, so now then, for the activity, the eating and dating, which is the best bit, I've got, and I'm going to link it over here. So we've got, it's a specially constructed layer cake done beforehand. My wife's really good at making these. I'm really good at eating them. I specialise in eating cakes. Spoons, practice trowels, plates, kitchen roll, inclusions, chalk drop, popping candy or biscuits, whatever, and knife with sheath. Yeah. So we need all of those, but I'm also going to need a handout, because actually just like that it's a bit hard. So what I've got is this handout, which is a sequence chart based from something called, in archaeology we call that matricing. And it will also double up as a handout after the session on the back that we'll look at. It's also a scaffold, so it will help people remember what they've done and what they're doing as they go. And I will made a note here with this handout. So this handout will be adapted to support level. So I'm going to do 3 versions of it. I'm going to do a very blank one, and I'm going to do some with a couple of clues on it, and some with a little bit more support on it, so that differentiates for ability. I'm also going to use pastel coloured paper. Blue is normally a good choice. Green is quite good. Got quite a lot of it because pastel coloured paper is more supportive for dyslexia stroke Erlins. And that's a universal design for learning approach, because remember, I don't know for sure, I'm suspected. Right. I'm also going to, well, hopefully my wife is going to do, we're going to make a second cake with what we call an inclusion, because it's what we call a cut and fill feature. A pit is basically cut in, and that really starts making stratigraphy a little bit more interesting, because there's something cutting through your layers. And it adds more choice of fillings as well, which is I always like. Right, so the resource then is differentiated here. The resource then is differentiated here. Right. that's all working quite well. Now then, we've also got, if you remember the welfare, we had to talk about those. So those are going into the introduction. What I should do is maybe put a little introduction there. And obviously the knife will pay attention to the activity here, so put that over there. Okay. So things start linking together, and these flow quite nicely. What I could do, and when you're using these micro teachers at a higher level, what you've got is each activity to a certain extent has its own learning outcome or its own learning criteria in front of it. So the activity here, which is to eat cake basically, is not the same as learning outcome 2, which I've already forgotten what it is, even though I made it, is relate, sequence, archaeology. So what I'm going to do is I'll use sequence here. Put the inclusions that you find in your cake in the sequence on your form in which you encounter them. Interestingly, the first one you eat is going to be the youngest because it's the newest in the order. So, well, as we do this, then during the activity, I'm also going to be discussing and adding extra content as required, so that the concepts that we've dealt in number 1 in a cognitive type approach, we start linking now here into the active experiential approach so that they can see it in action. Now then, I forgot to do this, and you really must remember to do this. CC, so cross-cutting or embedding. So I've got here ESDGC, so I'm going to look at the ethics of excavation, and we're going to have this informal background discussion, which will be a teaching approach. Because the nature of excavation is that it actually destroys the past. Well, whose past is that? Is that everybody's past? Does that have any ecological or historical damage to the environment? How does it also support heritage and tourism, so it can actually support the economy, and it can help in education? So there's global citizenship, and obviously as we're in Wales, I'm going to also link that to Welsh place names and to Welsh history, and that gives me more of a Welsh dimension. Literacy, this helps if you can spell one word right, is the vocabulary of key terms in archaeology. So, and to a certain extent, I'm going to have to remember to explain this jargon. That would be the more depth that you would go into, because obviously stratigraphy, not everybody may know what it is. Context in archaeology has a particular meaning, and as do inclusions or whatever. So there's particular vocabulary and its relationships to archaeology. But if, and remember I've only got a half-hour session, if this was longer, I would also be doing context recording, which is a key part of archaeology. Each element of the cake would need to be described in terms of colour, taste, how thick and stodgy, all those descriptive terms. So I'll be using descriptive language or developing descriptive language. Okay, numeracy. Well, in this particular case, the numeracy is very basic. It's sequence and order. So I've just noted it's very basic, and therefore it's not really included. I'm not really supporting literacy in this session. So numeracy, I mean. So numeracy, what I've made a note is numeracy will follow in a future session, which will be linked to basic survey and archaeological recording and section stroke plan. I should also do the same thing for IT, because I'm actually not supporting IT in this section. In the micro teach and in your organisation, if you're not embedding it, then please give a reason why you're not embedding it and point out where it could be embedded or would be embedded in the future. Okay, so those are now working quite nicely, and on each one of these I've said, so the lecture is linking to learning outcome 1, the activity to learning outcome 1 and 2, and the plenary will be coming to learning outcome 1 and 2, and therefore back to the aim. So it's a bit like there and back again. I know where I'm going, and I've got everything going out. Now to constructively align, I'm going to align the assessment to those so that then I mirror those steps going back the other way. So I've got those resources which are now supporting the learning, and there's nothing there that is not. I haven't just stuck in a random thing like a dice, which is not going to be needed. Okay, so then the assessment section. So we're looking at, I'm going to do an initial assessment, and I'm going to do what I call APL, which is assess prior learning. So in this particular case, and I'm going to use questioning to do this. I'll just take that out there a second. So assessing prior learning is, does anybody know about stratigraphy? Has anybody been on an archaeological site? Find out what people know. This helps me adjust some of the content that I will need to include, and I'm going to go back and show you where I'm going to include it in a minute. And that helps me also, if I do have anybody that knows quite a lot, then I've already got an MKO, a more knowledgeable other. So I might be able to use that person to help. Okay, so I'm now going to link assessment to each element. So the intro tutor-led lecture, I'm going to use questioning, and it's primarily constructively aligned to learning outcome 1, partly to learning outcome 2. For number 2, the activity, I'm going to use a formative observation technique, which will be eating and sequence dating activity, watching it, and then stepping in as required. And we're also going to be using informal discussion in the background, but I'll come to that, so I haven't put it in there yet. And that's constructively aligned to learning outcome 2. Then, I've only got a half-hour session, so we're going to do, which is really great because the session is going to be shorter than this video. So then we're going to do a plenary, so that's summative. I've made a note to myself, summative for formative. I'm going to make sure that this links to when people visit sites or start going on further, because any form of assessment, in my opinion, that doesn't have a formative or constructive purpose probably shouldn't be used, but that's a personal thing. Okay, so the summative is for the tutor, but also self and peer, so that the learners know what they've done. So I'm going to use questioning again here, but also the activity itself becomes an assessment, because they will have created a dating sequence that they can see in front of them, and that will show basic stratigraphy and dating in the context, because the the last items to discovered will be the older items because they were below. So that starts talking about deposition and the order of deposition. Okay, and then maybe if there's external extra, so this is an extra activity, it's the more in-depth on the informal discussion, dating and stratigraphy, cut features, disturbance, relational dating and context, and secure and description. When an artifact is found securely inside a context, then that links it to that context or event in time. But if it is on the margin, on the edge, then it's not secure because it could be in either or could be affected by either. But that's more in depth. Probably wouldn't have time for that in half an hour. So, okay, that's quite nice. Now then, we're now going to start justifying some of our approaches. So, I tend to favour teaching methods which are student-centred, humanist, or post-humanist, but we won't go there, active, and I also tend to think about learning as a transformative. So that means you've got to have that transformative experience of doing it. And I haven't used backwards this time. It's one of my favourites. And discovery, well, one of Bruner's theories, which I quite like. So it's discovering the learning approach. Arguably, that this constructivist type approach is discovery as well. So, but how? Well, this is when now it becomes a little bit trickier. So I'm going to add in a note here. Lecture. Passive, although if you've ever been in one of my lectures, you know they're not very passive at all, because I will try to involve students. Them involve learners as much as possible. Okay. Now, passive learning is not something that I like. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, it's just not what I like. So therefore I like to involve my learners as much as possible to make it more active, so I'll use a lot more questioning, for delivery, as opposed to just telling, and it makes it a little bit more interactive. So that's an approach, but you could argue that approach good for content delivery, and it sits in the cognitive domain. Cool. Now here with this activity, there's actually, I'm going to now add a discussion element. So I'm just going to come onto here, and I'm going to informal discussion. That's the ESDGC. Background content, cognitive domain, but also in here we are linking to here. So we are also linking to this is active learning. The learners are actively doing it, which is a far more student-centered approach. It is also experiential because we're mimicking the experience, so it's contextualized-ish, and also because they're doing, we are linking the psychomotive domain. Great, let's now just pop some. Now, so you can see the theories coming in and adapting now. I can also, with the ESDGC, so if I come back into there, ESDGC, so by talking about those in ethics, and should we be doing this, what is the value, why is it, and that starts coming into the affective domain. So now I've got all three of the key domains of learning as noted by Bloom coming in there, but I'm also, it's justifying those particular approaches. Why are they of value, why are they working? I could do more and more because and this is where your rationale can get quite out of hand, because obviously if you're going to be constructing the learning, they're going to be constructing their own dating record. That is a constructivist activity. So it's how we link theory, it's how we justify things, and also now we've got have I reached these? So remember, for the introduction I've used questioning, I've used observation, and I've used questioning at the end as well, and I've checked those off, so they all now are linked. So the same, the learning outcomes linked to the learning activities and have been assessed, so therefore if they've been assessed, then we're okay. So I mentioned how we were going to assess, but I've also added a couple of notes that, as far as I'm concerned, the focus is on self and peer assessment as is an intro session, and learning only has any value if the learner recognises what is learned and the value of it. So because that is my personal philosophical belief, that is why the handout which is constructed is something that the learner can see and discuss with their peers. So that makes that more valuable. Now also I've got this aid memoir, so it's a session handout that scaffolds the memory and record of personal development, but also on the reverse are introductory notes on stratigraphy, Harris matrix, context dating, links to archaeological sites and course providers. So that is adding value if you're working to funding requirements, and it also is what we would call pathway to progression. So it's showing learners that this is something, but actually you can now go on to something else. So it has a value going forward. So it has that. So it has more purpose than just sitting. It's not just summative. There's a formative. There's something to follow. Have we got everything in there? Well, no. There's almost certainly stuff missing because of the way that there's more depth that you can go into. But I've got my teaching methods, and then I would, if I was working at a higher level, I would actually be saying why I'm using these. Why is a student-centered approach or an active learning approach better for my learners? You might find that for other learners an active approach isn't better. This is where you basically point out what you use and why you use it and why it works. I've included some of that, but I haven't left it all in because obviously I want you to think about that. So that is that. I can then look at and I can check everything, and then I go, yeah, I'm happy, and I can just cut and paste that to my rationale. You'll find then that also, if you think about it, that your lesson plan is now almost written itself. So it's worth spending time on the rationale. The reason for it helps with everything else. These take a long time at first. The better you get, the quicker they become. Although I will be honest, what tends to happen is the first couple of rationales you do reasonably effectively and reasonably quickly. Then they become much longer as you think harder about them, and then eventually they become easier. Nobody said moving into teaching was going to be an easy thing. Now remember, at your higher levels you will be linking your theory into these. So I've got developing a more knowledgeable other here, which would be linking to Vygotsky. I've got scaffolding, creating a scaffold resource, so that would be linking to Brunner. Please note, Brunner is the scaffolding. It has derived from Vygotsky's more knowledgeable other, but it's slightly different. I've got my student-centered approaches, which are in my case come from the client-centered approaches developed by how could you forget the name? Sam, that is so bad. I can't remember. This is where you should put things down in front of you. Carl Rogers. I go with a very informal approach, so I could talk about that in terms of Malcolm Knowles, and I tend to use informal learning because I tend to be more from a community education type background. So then I'm linking things. Now also I've talked about constructive alignment throughout, so I've looked at some bigs, and I've also got my measurable learning outcomes, and this is really quite important. So is relate or sequence the link? Yes, it is, and that is in the higher domain if you go with that approach. And I've got the first one being outline, which is probably a more you could have define or describe. So that's in the lower domain on balloons. You'll find that mine are a little bit mixed because I tend to use a solo taxonomy as opposed to Bloom's taxonomical verbs. Right, there you go. That's 45 minutes. Have fun, and I look forward to seeing some micro teachers. Just a note for those people who work with me, yeah, I tend to also have this activity going on in the background where each colour now is a learner's one putting together, so that the great thing about that is that do that as a group, because that allows you to have a look at other people's ideas and say, well, that's good. you haven't done this, you haven't done that, or can I have that idea, or how did you do that? Because then you'll get peer learning. That might be a good approach. Okay, well, thank you very much. Good luck with your micro teaching.